London, 1483. The city holds its breath. On a grim Sunday morning, a woman walks barefoot through the cobbled streets. She is draped in nothing but a thin linen shift, clutching a candle that flickers against the damp breeze. Her face is calm, but her presence ignites whispers and gasps. She is Jane Shore, once the most beloved mistress of King Edward IV, now reduced to a symbol of public shame. Crowds press in, not to jeer, but to witness the fall of a woman who once held the ear of a monarch. This is no ordinary punishment. It is the calculated revenge of a new king, Richard III, meant to erase her from history. But instead, Jane's dignity makes her unforgettable. Who was this woman? How did she rise from merchant's daughter to royal confidant? And why did the weight of an empire fall upon her shoulders? To understand the shame, we must return to the seduction, to the politics, and to the perilous climb of Jane Shore. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that falls not from peace, but from anticipation. Londoners emerged slowly from their homes that Sunday morning, drawn as if by instinct to a spectacle they could scarcely believe was real. Word had spread, traveling faster than any herald's cry. Jane Shore, the late King Edward's mistress, was to walk in penance. Some came out of duty, others out of morbid curiosity, but all carried in their eyes a mix of dread, fascination, and disbelief. There she appeared, barefoot, pale against the gloom, clothed only in a linen shift that clung to her as the damp morning air chilled her skin. A candle trembled in her hand, its flames swaying with each careful step over the uneven cobblestones. She did not weep. Her posture was upright. Her gaze did not fall to the ground. Though she walked in disgrace, there was a strange nobility in her bearing that unsettled even the hardest hearts. This was not how it was supposed to be. The new king, Richard III, had ordered this punishment as a message. The mistress of his brother was not to be admired. She was to be broken, displayed as an emblem of sin and treachery. But as Jane passed through the alleys and squares, something else happened. The people did not laugh. They did not spit. Many stood in reverent silence. A few wept. Even more extended their cloaks toward her, an offer of modesty she refused, not out of pride, but resolve. To the common eye, she was a fallen woman. But those who knew her story, truly knew, saw something more. A tragedy not born of vanity, but of loyalty, intelligence, and love in a court where such virtues could be fatal. Before she was Jane Shore, she had been Elizabeth Lambert, born around 1445 into a merchant family whose name carried respect in London's bustling trade circles. Her father, John Lambert, ran a successful shop in the heart of the city, dealing in fine cloth and precious goods. Her mother, Amy, came from a lineage of traders and ensured their daughter received a rare education. Elizabeth learned to read and write, practiced arithmetic, and even studied rudimentary Latin. She was a child with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, but it was her beauty that caused the city to pause. Men followed her with their eyes. Women watched her with wary respect. She did not use her looks to manipulate. Instead, she wielded them with awareness, always aware of the attention they drew but never chasing it. At 20, she was married to William Shore, a goldsmith of wealth and influence, and some 15 years her senior. The union, arranged by her father, was seen as a protection, a way to stabilize her future and shield her from the many admirers circling around. But it was not a marriage of affection. William was decent, perhaps even kind, but he never touched her heart. They had no children. In time, Elizabeth grew distant, restless, yearning not for wealth or station, but for meaning. It was during these listless years that she began to move within London's upper circles. Her charm was impossible to ignore. Poets, merchants, and minor nobles sought her company at gatherings and markets. Her laughter lingered like perfume in crowded parlors. She did not seek power, but power began to seek her. Then came Edward IV, tall, golden-haired, broad-shouldered. A king built like a warrior, with a hunger for life that matched the fires of war he had survived. He had returned from France victorious, and with that victory came indulgence. He liked to roam the city, cloaked and anonymous, mingling with commoners and sampling the lives of those far beneath his crown. He met Elizabeth Shore during one such excursion. The first glance was enough. Their eyes locked, and the chemistry between them sparked like flint against stone. It was not only her beauty that intrigued him, but her wit, her refusal to fawn, her ease in conversation, her awareness of courtly games without any need to play them. Within months, she became his mistress. She annulled her marriage, citing William's impotence, a scandalous but not uncommon move. Soon, Elizabeth Lambert faded from public mention, and Jane Shore emerged, her name forever tied to the crown. But Jane was not like the others. Edward had many lovers, most of whom clung to him for land, titles, jewels. Jane asked for none. Instead, she pleaded for lives. She intervened in royal judgments, softened the king's anger, and secured pardons for those who might otherwise have faced execution or exile. She became the kingdom's quiet power broker. When a merchant was wrongly accused, they came to Jane. When a noble fell from favor, they sought her word to the king. She was not feared, like the usual mistresses, but loved. And her influence grew not from seduction, but mercy. Court festivals glittered with her presence. She walked beside Edward during banquets, her face lit with laughter, her eyes always alert. Edward was deeply taken, though he never married her. Many whispered that she was the only woman who truly held his heart. But fate would not allow their chapter to last. On April 9th, 1483, Edward IV died suddenly. Some said from pneumonia, others from poison. He was only 40. His son, Edward V, a child of 12, was meant to ascend the throne. But with a boy king came regents, and with regents came ambition. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized the moment. He moved swiftly, naming himself Lord Protector. Within weeks, he imprisoned his young nephew and declared all of Edward IV's children illegitimate. Jane was left adrift. Without her protector, she became a target. She sought new alliances, aligning herself with Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset, Edward's stepson. Simultaneously, she deepened her connection to William Hastings, the loyal Lord Chamberlain and Edward's lifelong confidant. But these ties drew danger like blood draws wolves. Richard saw in Jane not a woman, but a bridge between factions, a symbol of the old king's favor. And in a court where symbols held the weight of armies, she had to be silenced. What began as royal admiration had become political threat. Jane Shore, who once whispered into the ear of the king, now walked alone through the streets of London, her candle flickering, her name smeared, her body trembling not from shame, but from the cold hand of power that sought to erase her from history. Yet as the city watched her walk, they did not see a traitor. They saw a woman who had once wielded grace like a sword and kindness like a shield, and who, even in her darkest hour, would not let go of her dignity. The Tower of London cast long shadows over the city that June. Its stone walls, once a symbol of royal might, now whispered of treachery and blood. Within those ancient chambers, a storm brewed, one that would sweep through the nobility and spare no one who dared to whisper resistance. The old king was dead, and his crown rested uneasily on the head of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had declared himself king. Edward V, the child who should have inherited his father's legacy, had vanished into silence within the tower, along with his brother. The world called it protection, but those close to power knew better. Among those who lingered dangerously near the throne's new occupant was Jane Shore. Though she had once basked in royal favor, she now stood at the edge of a blade sharpened by ambition and paranoia. In Richard's eyes, Jane was more than just the discarded mistress of his brother. She was a living connection to the old order, to Edward's court, to a time and king that still pulsed in the hearts of Londoners. That made her dangerous. Even more damning was her new web of alliances. She had entered into an intimate relationship with Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset, the stepson of the late king, and a Woodville by blood. The Woodvilles, led by the Queen Dowager Elizabeth, were seen by Richard as scheming interlopers, a nest of vipers determined to control the young Edward V and the regency. Jane, knowingly or not, had stepped into the eye of a political hurricane. Her closeness to Dorset tied her to a faction that Richard viewed as traitorous. As if this were not enough, Jane also maintained a strong relationship with William Hastings, Lord Chamberlain and one of the most powerful men in the realm. Hastings was no fool. He had served Edward IV faithfully for decades and had been instrumental in keeping the court balanced during turbulent years. But Hastings, too, clung to the past, and he placed his trust in Jane, allowing her to pass messages, carry whispers, broker quiet allegiances. Between Dorset and Hastings, Jane became an invisible courier, a thread connecting the old king's allies in a secret resistance against Richard's sudden rise. Richard moved swiftly and without warning. On June 13, 1483, during a council meeting at the Tower, he accused Hastings of treason. There was no trial. There was no time for protest. Hastings was dragged from the room and executed on the spot, his head struck from his body within the hour. It was a brutal message. No man was above suspicion. In the same breath, Richard turned his attention to Jane. She was arrested that same evening, pulled from her residence, and taken into custody. The charges were thick with venom: conspiracy, sedition, harboring traitors, even witchcraft. A common accusation when power alone wasn't enough to silence a woman. Though the witchcraft charge would not hold in the face of reason, it did its job. The whisper alone was enough to smear her. She was thrown into Ludgate Prison, a place of dark corridors and colder reputations, where the highborn and disgraced waited for death or royal mercy. Richard did not seek her death. He wanted her broken, not as a warning to her, but to others, to those who might speak of Edward IV with fondness, to those who still dared to believe the princes in the Tower had any claim to the throne. He declared that Jane Shore, in punishment for her immoral life and political intrigues, would make a public penance, stripped of dignity, exposed to the scorn of the people. But once again, Richard underestimated her. When Jane emerged from prison on that gray Sunday morning, she did not weep. She did not cower. Clothed only in her shift, she walked through the city like a woman going to prayer. Her candle flickered in the wind, but she walked steadily, her eyes clear. The people who had gathered expected to see shame. Instead, they saw something far more dangerous to a usurper king: admiration. Londoners lined the route from Ludgate to St. Paul's Cross, the outdoor pulpit where sermons were delivered and penance pronounced. Some lowered their eyes. Others whispered blessings. A few dared to smile at her in quiet solidarity. She was no longer just the king's mistress. She had become something else, a symbol of quiet resistance. Even her beauty, though worn by sorrow, still glowed in the morning light, further complicating the spectacle Richard had designed to degrade her. When she reached St. Paul's Cross, she stood tall. She accepted her sentence without tears or plea. And when her walk ended, she was led back into the shadows of Ludgate, not defeated, but transformed in the eyes of the public. In her cell, time passed slowly, marked only by the shifting quality of light through the high, narrow window. But even there, behind iron and stone, Jane Shore's presence drew attention. One man, in particular, would change her fate again. Thomas Lynham, the king's own Solicitor General, had come on official business. What he found was not the harlot the regime had described, but a woman of extraordinary poise and depth. Their meetings grew more frequent. Conversation deepened into respect, and respect into affection. Lynham, a man of law and logic, found himself moved by something rare and genuine in Jane. He did what no one expected. He asked for her hand in marriage. The news enraged Richard. Lynham was his officer. To wed a woman who had just been condemned publicly was a direct challenge to royal authority. Richard threatened him: loss of office, loss of wealth, even imprisonment. But Lynham would not back down. He argued that Jane had suffered enough, that her crimes were political inventions, that her dignity in the face of disgrace was a mark of character few at court could claim. Eventually, faced with pressure and unwilling to risk alienating his remaining loyalists, Richard relented. He granted Jane a royal pardon. In 1484, she walked free from Ludgate not as a fallen mistress, but as a wife and mother-to-be. She and Lynham were married quietly and settled in Hertfordshire, far from the court's treacherous intrigues. When Richard fell at Bosworth Field a year later, and Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, the country changed again. Lynham lost his place as Solicitor General, but Henry, ever the tactician, did not discard him. Instead, he appointed him to administrative posts in Wales and entrusted him with responsibilities tied to Prince Arthur's household. Jane, now a mother and wife, faded from scandalous memory into a quieter life of family, domesticity, and charity. Years passed. Her fame dimmed, but never vanished. Her past remained, but no longer haunted her. Instead, it gave her insight. Jane began using her experience to help other women who had suffered, those abandoned, accused, or destitute. She became a figure of counsel and aid, not through wealth, but wisdom earned in the crucible of politics and shame. Her later life was marked not by sorrow, but by a surprising kind of grace. She lived to see England change hands again and again. She saw the birth of new dynasties, the rise of future queens. And through it all, she remained steady, her story no longer shaped by kings, but by the strength of her own character. When she died in 1527, in her early 80s, it was quietly, without spectacle. She was buried in Hinksworth, in a modest church, her final resting place far from the echoing halls of Westminster and the shadowed walkways of the Tower. But her story did not stay buried. It found new life in poems, in plays, in brushstrokes. Shakespeare gave her breath in Richard III. Painters like William Blake captured her infamous walk in images that still evoke a haunting reverence. Even centuries later, her moment of humiliation echoed in fiction, in tales of queens walking for their sins, in shows and films where a woman's fall becomes the crucible for her legacy. Jane Shore remains one of the most fascinating women in English history, not because she seduced a king, but because she survived him. Not because she wielded power, but because she refused to be destroyed by it. Her beauty may have opened doors, but it was her courage that kept her name alive long after kings were buried and crowns were passed. Her story endures, not as caution, but as testament.